Energy flow isn't just a metaphor for how we get through the day, it's the fundamental architecture of our social and spiritual structures, a concept Joe Bandel explores through the lens of electrical engineering in his OAK matrix Anchor 16. Bandel posits a massive shift from what he calls direct current initiation, which is rigid and hierarchical, to an alternating current model that thrives on reciprocity and the integration of the shadow self. This isn't just about personal growth, it's a claim that our old systems of power are structurally incapable of handling the complexity of the modern world. Why does this technical analogy matter so much for how we understand human connection and personal evolution?
It matters because it highlights a design flaw in traditional systems. When Bandel talks about the old Kabbalah, or traditional hierarchical structures operating like direct current, or DC, he's describing a one-way street. In a DC circuit, electrons flow in a single direction from a source to a load. Bandel uses this to illustrate a top-down power dynamic, where authority flows from the master to the masses, or, as he puts it, the hammer of the people channeled by the chisel of the master. It's built on uniformity and mass consciousness. The problem is that a one-directional system has no mechanism for feedback or integration. It creates a polarized world where you have extremes, the holy and the evil, with no space for the gray areas of the human experience.
The polarizing nature of DC is an interesting way to frame why those systems often feel so oppressive. If the energy only moves one way, anything that doesn't fit the holy or ideal pole is automatically exiled to the shadow pole. But isn't that just a natural byproduct of having standards or a clear moral compass? You have to define what's good to know what to avoid. Why does Bandel see this as a structural impossibility for integration rather than just a clear boundary?
Because in that DC model, the poles are facing away from each other. They're back to back. They never actually see or engage with one another. If you're constantly pushing the shadow away, you're not managing it. You're just creating a blind spot. Historically, we see this in institutions that claim total moral purity while harboring deep internal corruption. The system forbids the integration of the shadow, so the shadow just grows in the dark until it becomes destructive. Bandel's critique is that this unidirectional control actually allows for abuse because there's no internal self-correction. It relies on a mob consciousness to sustain its power, which is inherently volatile and prone to manipulation.
So the shift to alternating current, or AC, is meant to solve that lack of feedback. In physics, AC is about oscillation. The flow of electrons reverses direction periodically. How does that translate into the OAK matrix? Is he suggesting we just flip-flop between good and evil, or is there something more stable at play?
It's much more stable, actually. He calls it a perpetual tank current. In electronics, a tank circuit is a combination of an inductor and a capacitor that can store energy and oscillate at a specific frequency. It self-maintains and self-clears. In the OAK matrix, this represents a reciprocal, oscillating flow between what he calls the expansive surge and the containing return. Instead of power being a top-down hierarchy, it becomes relational. Opposites face forward together, a concept he calls mirror circle Kabbalah. They're holding hands in a shared world rather than being locked in a back-to-back struggle. This allows the system to hold both light and shadow in a loving tension, where fragments of ourselves become friends to be integrated rather than enemies to be conquered.
That idea of fragments as friends is a radical departure from the war on shadow we see in so many spiritual traditions. But let's push on the power source. Bandel says that instead of mass consciousness, this AC model draws power from intimate, consensual resonances. He mentions soulmate cycles and species-to-species awareness. That sounds beautiful, but is it scalable? Can a system built on intimate resonance actually replace a mass consciousness structure that currently runs our world?
That's the big question, isn't it? Bandel suggests that the old DC systems are already beginning to fail because they cannot handle the current influx of energy. He uses the phrase, "those who live by the sword die by the sword," to describe how efforts to dominate in the old way are backfiring. Their own distortions are being amplified because the system can't integrate the shadow. As for scalability, the OAK matrix emphasizes diversity and self-correction. It's not about creating one giant uniform grid. It's about a network of coherent relational nodes. It's a shift from rigid uniformity to what he calls relational coherence. It thrives on diversity because diversity provides the different frequencies needed for a rich, oscillating current.
The reference to courts of chaos and the logos adds a layer of literary depth here, pulling from Roger Zelazny's Chronicles of Amber. In those books, the pattern represents order and rigidity, while the logos is the shifting, mutable essence of chaos. Bandel says souls stuck in the DC model will be drawn into the courts of chaos to learn what Amber already knows, embrace rather than polarity. Is he suggesting that we need a bit of chaos to break the rigidity of our current structures?
Exactly. In Zelazny's world, the logos is a three-dimensional, constantly altering maze. It's fluid. Bandel is using this to show that the path to higher wholeness isn't through more rigid order, but through a fluidity that can hold both order and chaos in tension. The OAK matrix sits at that transition point. It's young and fresh, as he says, but it's capable of holding both courts, the rigid and the fluid, until they resolve into something higher. It's about moving from a binary choice of this or that to a state of both and. If you can't embrace the chaos within yourself, you'll be destroyed by the chaos outside of you.
That's a sobering thought. He mentions that those who try to use the old DC Kabbalah for personal gain will find their distortions amplified. It sounds like a spiritual circuit breaker is tripping. If the energy coming in is alternating and you're trying to process it through a direct current wire, the heat buildup from resistance is going to melt the wire. Is that a fair way to look at the self-destruction he mentions?
That's a perfect analogy. In electrical terms, if you try to run a high-load AC device on a thin DC-rated wire without the proper frequency handling, you get massive resistance, heat, and eventually a fire. Bandel is saying that the energetic influx of this new cycle is essentially too much for the old, rigid hierarchies to handle. They don't have the cooling system of integration. When you can't integrate your shadow, the shadow becomes your primary adversary. The more you try to control it, the more it pushes back. We see this in the way modern power structures often create the very problems they claim to be solving. They're trying to hammer a complex, oscillating reality into a flat, one-way chisel.
But the mirror circle Kabbalah sounds almost too idealistic. If we're holding hands with our opposites, doesn't that risk a loss of identity? If the holy and the evil are just fragments that are friends, do we lose the ability to name and resist actual harm? Or is there a different kind of boundary in the AC model?
The boundary in the AC model is coherence, not exclusion. Think about a musical chord. You have different notes, frequencies that might be dissonant on their own, but when they oscillate together in a specific ratio, they create a harmony that's more powerful than a single note. It's not about losing identity. It's about shifting from being an isolated pole to being part of a resonance. Resistance to harm doesn't come from exiling the bad part, but from the self-correcting nature of the tank current. If one part of the circuit becomes too distorted, the oscillation itself works to clear it. It's a biological model of morality rather than a legalistic one. It's about health and flow rather than crime and punishment.
It reminds me of the distinction between power over and power with. The DC model is clearly power over, unidirectional control. The AC model is power with, relational and reciprocal. But in a world where everyone is chasing power over to survive, how does an individual start to build an AC circuit in their own life? Bandel talks about soulmate cycles and species-to-species awareness. Those aren't things you can just buy at a store.
No, it starts with internal work, what he calls the integration of shades of gray. It means looking at the parts of yourself you've been taught to exile, your anger, your fear, your evil thoughts, and instead of trying to conquer them, you face them forward. You see them as fragments that have a function. Maybe your anger is actually a distorted form of your protective instinct. When you integrate it, it stops being a shadow that sabotages you and becomes a friend that provides necessary boundary energy. That's the mirror circle within the self. Once you have that internal coherence, you naturally start to seek out consensual resonances with others who are doing the same. It's an organic growth from the inside out, like an oak tree.
The transition he describes from rigid uniformity to relational coherence seems to be the central struggle of our time. We're seeing it in politics, in technology, even in how we view the environment. We're moving away from the idea that we can just dominate nature or each other and realizing that everything is an interconnected circuit. If the tank current self-maintains, then the goal isn't to work harder to maintain the system, but to get the frequency right so it maintains itself.
Exactly. It's about efficiency and sustainability. The old way is exhausting because it requires constant work to suppress the shadow and keep the power flowing in one direction. The new way is self-sustaining because the return flow feeds the surge. It's a leap into a higher wholeness where we stop fighting ourselves. Bandel's Anchor 16 is a roadmap for that leap. It's telling us that the shadow we're so afraid of isn't a monster to be slain, but the missing half of our power grid. When we finally let it in, the light doesn't just get brighter, it starts to dance.
The shift from one-way control to reciprocal flow isn't just a spiritual theory, it's a structural necessity for a world that's becoming increasingly complex and interconnected. By understanding our personal and collective energy as an alternating current, we move away from the exhaustion of constant suppression and toward a self-correcting, resilient way of being. Integrating the shadow isn't about becoming gray or losing our edges, it's about completing the circuit so that our full potential can finally be expressed. If this exploration of the OAK matrix sparked a new perspective for you, pass it along to someone who's ready to look at their own shadow in a new light.